Part 1. Day 11,302 of the war. Europe has finally reached a fragile understanding, at least on paper, about what security guarantees for Ukraine might look like. Behind closed doors in Berlin, leaders who once spoke in cautious tones now whisper about commitments that could redefine the continent's post-war order. For 2 days, the marble corridors of government buildings echoed with measured optimism and tension. When the joint statement was finally released, it sounded both promising and incomplete, filled with carefully chosen words that hid as much as they revealed. The document spoke of solidarity, of shared responsibility, of a Europe that could finally act not only as an observer, but as a guarantor of peace. And yet, one name was conspicuously absent: America's. The plan on paper is ambitious, 6 points outlining a new European framework for Ukraine's future: military, diplomatic, and economic guarantees, commitments to reconstruction, even a legal mechanism for response in case of renewed aggression. But in reality, these are still declarations, sketches of a future agreement that might never materialize without the United States' final word. The signatures on the bottom, from Scholz, Macron, Meloni, Tusk, Starmer, and others, reflect unity. But it is a unity born out of necessity, not confidence. As one European diplomat admitted off record, we're preparing for a future where Washington might not pick up the phone. For Ukraine, the details of these promises matter. They mean survival and a chance to rebuild a state that has been tested beyond measure. The first points of the Berlin framework include continued large-scale assistance for Ukraine's armed forces, the creation of a multinational Ukrainian coalition under European leadership, and, most notably, a system for monitoring ceasefires with direct American involvement. In principle, these could amount to the most robust security guarantees Ukraine has ever had. In practice, they depend on a future that feels uncertain, especially with the American political landscape in flux. That uncertainty only deepened after Donald Trump's latest comments. Speaking from his Mar-a-Lago residence, the former and potentially future U.S. president hinted that his patience is running thin, but also that things are moving in the right direction. His remarks, delivered with his characteristic mix of improvisation and calculation, left observers unsure whether he intended to support or sabotage the European proposal. "We're working with Europe," Trump said, "on guarantees to make sure this war doesn't start again. It never should have started. It was a Biden problem, but we'll fix it." The words were meant to sound reassuring. Instead, they raised new questions. What does fixing it mean for Kiev? Zelensky's team insists progress is being made. According to sources in Berlin, the Americans presented Ukraine with a draft of security commitments designed to break the deadlock in negotiations. The proposal, still confidential, reportedly includes provisions resembling NATO's Article 5. An attack on Ukraine would trigger an immediate joint response. For Kiev, that language is essential. For Moscow, it is intolerable. The delicate dance of diplomacy continues as U.S. officials quietly consult their Russian counterparts through back channels, hoping to avoid the appearance of capitulation from either side. A follow-up session is already rumored to take place in Miami over the weekend, a meeting that could either finalize or fracture months of progress. Meanwhile, in Ukraine itself, patience and resilience remain extraordinary. According to a new poll by the Kyiv International Institute of Sociology, more than 70% of Ukrainians are ready to accept a peace plan based on the current front lines, as long as the deal includes strong, enforceable security guarantees. It's a reflection of both fatigue and determination, a nation unwilling to surrender, yet pragmatic enough to seek stability. Only 9% expect the war to end before 2026. Most are prepared to endure as long as it takes, provided that justice and safety are preserved. And while politicians debate the architecture of peace, the war itself has not paused. The Russian military continues its relentless strikes on Ukraine's power infrastructure, trying to plunge cities into darkness and cold as winter deepens. But the Ukrainian spirit holds firm. Volunteers continue raising funds for generators in Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv, and Sumy. Each donation, no matter how small, becomes a silent act of defiance, a statement that life will not stop. If you're watching this and want to help, you can find the link in the description. Even one contribution can keep the light on for a family hiding from shelling tonight. At the same time, Europe is preparing new sanctions. The European Council has announced fresh measures targeting Russian shipping companies and individuals tied to Rosneft and Lukoil, entities accused of smuggling oil through shadow fleets. It's another move to close the loopholes that have allowed Russia to finance its war through backdoor trade. Yet even these sanctions reveal the same pattern. Europe acts, but cautiously, always a few steps behind the scale of events. And then came the explosion of the day, both literal and political. Reports emerged that Ukrainian sea drones had attacked a Russian submarine in Novorossiysk. Initial information from the SBU claims that a vessel of the Varshavyanka class, used to launch caliber missiles against Ukrainian cities, was critically damaged. If confirmed, it would mark a new turning point in naval warfare, the first successful underwater drone strike on a submarine in history. Russian military bloggers rushed to deny the damage, claiming the submarine survived, but their tone betrayed alarm. Even they admitted the unthinkable. The Black Sea Fleet remains defenseless against Ukraine's growing drone capabilities. "This is a serious warning," one wrote. "We are not ready for this kind of war." And that's just the beginning. What's happening behind the scenes and why these attacks, both on sea and on land, might change the strategic balance of the entire war, we'll discuss right after this. Stay with us, subscribe, and don't miss the next part, because the story is only just unfolding. Part 2. As the world watched Berlin, the real drama unfolded far from conference tables and diplomatic phrases. The negotiations had only just concluded, but their ripple effects were already felt across continents. In Washington, officials scrambled to interpret what exactly the Europeans had promised. At the Pentagon, analysts examined the implications of creating a multinational Ukrainian coalition, realizing that for the first time, Europe might field a semi-permanent force under its own command, with or without full American leadership. The plan envisioned a network of forward-deployed logistics hubs in Poland, Romania, and Slovakia, essentially a protective ring around Ukraine's borders. Inside Ukraine, it meant direct integration of Western systems, intelligence, and even personnel into national defense. What NATO once feared to do openly, Europe now considered inevitable. For Kiev, this marked a turning point. President Volodymyr Zelensky returned from Berlin visibly cautious but optimistic. "We are moving forward," he said, choosing his words carefully. "The guarantees are not final, but the architecture is beginning to take shape. It is important that our partners understand. Peace must be defended, not declared." Behind the scenes, his advisors understood that time was short. The Americans had hinted that their window for ratifying any treaty might close before January. Trump's circle, while publicly supportive, signaled that every clause would be renegotiated once he officially took office. It created an atmosphere of pressure that many in Kiev described as a countdown clock we didn't set. Meanwhile, the battlefield reflected the contradictions of diplomacy. In the south, Ukrainian naval drones continued their silent operations. Satellite imagery confirmed damage in Novorossiysk harbor, debris scattered near the piers where Russia's Black Sea submarines usually docked. Independent analysts from Oryx and the Institute for the Study of War cautiously agreed. At least one submarine had likely been disabled. Russian social media exploded with conflicting narratives. Some claimed a minor explosion near the pier. Others whispered about casualties and the fire in the comment section. The Ministry of Defense in Moscow remained silent. But for the first time, Russian naval channels openly admitted that underwater defense systems were insufficient against unmanned threats. The admission alone was historic. At the same time, Ukraine's drone campaign expanded to the Caspian. Within days, strikes hit oil and gas platforms belonging to Lukoil in the northern Caspian Sea, infrastructure previously considered untouchable. The attacks were precise, targeting compressor stations and control systems. Satellite photos later revealed smoke columns rising dozens of meters above the water. The Ukrainian Security Service confirmed its involvement, stating that critical energy infrastructure used to fund the war effort had been rendered inoperable. Moscow again denied the incident, but traffic data from regional shipping lanes told another story. Tankers were rerouted, operations paused. The message was clear. Even deep inside Russia's logistical rear, nowhere was safe anymore. The same night, explosions were reported at the Astrakhan gas processing plant, a facility belonging to Gazprom and central to Russia's fuel supply for military purposes. Ukrainian forces later described the operation as a strategic strike to reduce the enemy's ability to produce explosives. The attack triggered a chain of fires that took hours to extinguish. Firefighters struggled amid reports of secondary detonations.
Russian state media downplayed the damage, but insiders admitted production had halted temporarily. A similar incident at the Saratov refinery 2 days earlier had already disrupted regional supply lines. For the 10th time in a year, the facility was struck, proof that Ukrainian long-range drone warfare had evolved into a systematic campaign targeting Russia's energy backbone. While these strikes captured headlines, life inside Ukraine was a battle of endurance. In Dnipropetrovsk, rescuers worked under constant shelling to restore electricity after waves of Russian drone attacks. In Sumy, power lines were destroyed twice within 24 hours. The images of burnt transformers and frozen neighborhoods contrasted with the quiet determination of volunteers delivering generators. "Reliable rear means reliable front," one of them said on local television, echoing the spirit that has sustained Ukraine since the first days of invasion. Across cities, ordinary citizens donated through online platforms, turning small contributions into tangible survival: a heater, a battery, a light in the dark. The Washington Post published a stark report. Ukraine's energy grid, they wrote, was being deliberately fragmented into isolated zones. Russian missile strategy had shifted from mass destruction to controlled paralysis, striking nodes to force local collapses instead of national blackouts. The goal was psychological, to convince Ukrainians that resistance was futile, that the state was disintegrating piece by piece. Yet surveys showed the opposite effect. Support for continuing the fight remained above 60%, unchanged even after the harshest winter months. Zelensky's approval rating, rather than falling, climbed slightly. Political scientists called it the resilience paradox. The more pressure Russia applied, the more unified Ukrainian society became. Inside Russia, cracks continued to widen. A series of reports from soldiers at the Kupiansk and Pokrovsk fronts revealed staggering losses and collapsing morale. One serviceman from the 589th Rifle Regiment recorded a video describing how his entire company had been sent into the meat grinder. His words, though softened in official transcripts, painted a devastating picture of chaos, lack of leadership, and despair. Commanders, he claimed, forced troops to advance across minefields, ignoring casualties. "Everyone was gone within 2 days," he said. The fragile balance of diplomacy is now merging with a global race for influence, as the outcome of the Ukrainian war threatens to redraw the entire post-Cold War map. The Miami talks, tentatively scheduled between Ukrainian and American delegations, have already become the focal point of political speculation. Sources close to both teams suggest that the United States plans to present an updated framework of guarantees, one that would include immediate deployment of defensive systems, joint training missions, and a commitment to maintain a long-term NATO advisory presence in Ukraine
even after the end of hostilities. Though not formal membership, this arrangement would bind Kiev to Western security architecture more tightly than ever before. For Russia, it would signal the loss of any remaining leverage. For Europe, it would mean the end of an era of strategic ambiguity. The plan's most debated element is the concept of rapid response formations. These units, built from combined European forces, would rotate in and out of Ukraine under a shared mandate. The idea, modeled partly on NATO's response force, aims to guarantee immediate intervention in case of renewed aggression. In practice, it would mark Europe's transformation from a financial supporter into an active participant in Ukraine's defense. Critics warn that it risks escalation, but proponents argue that only a credible deterrent can secure peace. France and Germany are said to be drafting operational guidelines, while Poland and the Baltic states push for even stronger commitments. London, under Prime Minister Keir Starmer, has offered to lead the naval component of the coalition, ensuring protection of Ukraine's ports and maritime routes in the Black Sea. Behind these political maneuvers lies a quieter but equally decisive battle, the struggle for reconstruction funds. As the war grinds on, Kiev's economic future becomes a contest among global powers. The European Investment Bank, the World Bank, and private consortiums are already outlining projects worth hundreds of billions. Roads, bridges, power grids, and industries destroyed by war are to be rebuilt, but not without political conditions. Western corporations see Ukraine as both a moral obligation and a strategic investment. The question is, who will control the process? Zelensky's administration insists on transparency, inviting Western auditors to oversee every stage. But corruption remains a sensitive topic, and every scandal threatens to weaken Kiev's bargaining position in negotiations for guarantees. The reality, however, is that Ukraine has few alternatives. Russian forces continue their slow, grinding assaults along the eastern front. Near Kupiansk, the situation remains dire. Satellite images show miles of destroyed fortifications, abandoned vehicles, and burned-out positions. Russian units have tried to encircle Ukrainian troops, but with little success. The terrain, ravaged by constant shelling, has become a wasteland of mud and steel. Ukrainian commanders describe the fighting as the war of inches. Territory changes hands, but the cost is devastating. According to analysts, Russia has lost more armored vehicles in the Kupiansk-Pokrovsk sector than during the first 3 months of its 2022 offensive. Yet the Kremlin pushes forward, driven by the illusion of progress. In the south, Ukraine's own operations are becoming increasingly sophisticated. Long-range drones now strike strategic fuel depots in Rostov, Volgograd, and even as far as the Ural industrial belt. Each attack forces Russia to divert air defense units from the front lines, stretching their resources thin. The Ukrainian military's adaptation to technological warfare, drones, cyber attacks, satellite coordination, is changing the very definition of modern conflict. Analysts at the Royal United Services Institute in London describe Ukraine as the first nation to build a hybrid defense system entirely from civilian innovation. Startups, volunteers, and engineers have created a decentralized defense network where every smartphone can become part of the intelligence system. This civilian-military synergy, unimaginable in past wars, is now Ukraine's greatest strategic advantage. Meanwhile, Russia's domestic situation continues to deteriorate. Economic indicators, though masked by state statistics, reveal a slow but irreversible decline. The ruble remains unstable, inflation accelerates, and Western sanctions have begun to erode the core of the energy export model. The shadow fleet that once bypassed restrictions is now under increasing pressure as Europe and the United States target intermediary companies in the Middle East and Asia. Insurance premiums for Russian oil tankers have tripled, while key shipping hubs quietly reduce cooperation. For ordinary Russians, the reality is visible in everyday life. rising food prices, shortages of imported goods, and a growing sense of isolation. Social media, despite censorship, continues to leak videos from the front lines and military bases. The most striking are not combat scenes, but confessions. Soldiers openly describing the horrors of their own army, the neglect, the brutality of commanders, and the despair of those who realize there is no way out. These testimonies, recorded in whispered tones, are spreading through encrypted channels, forming an underground narrative that contradicts official propaganda. Families of the missing hold vigils in provincial towns, hoping for information that never comes. The number of graves in small cemeteries grows daily. The illusion of victory is maintained by fear and silence. Back in Ukraine, the resilience of civil society continues to astonish even hardened observers. Schools reopen in bombed towns, teachers conducting lessons from basements powered by generators. Artists and writers document the war not only as tragedy, but as rebirth, the forging of a national identity that has united regions once divided by language and politics. The church, NGOs, and volunteer networks have become parallel institutions of governance. Each blackout, each missile strike, is followed by rapid restoration, as if defiance itself has become the new rhythm of daily life. Internationally, support for Ukraine fluctuates but endures. Public opinion in Europe remains mostly favorable, even as fatigue sets in. In the United States, political divisions sharpen. The upcoming election has turned Ukraine into a symbol, for some, of freedom and resistance, for others, of costly entanglement. Trump's comments about finishing the war without explaining how send shivers through European capitals. Diplomats quietly prepare contingency plans for every possible outcome, including a scenario where Washington withdraws from future funding. Yet the most surprising development comes from Asia. Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan have all increased their humanitarian and technological support for Kyiv, understanding that the fate of Ukraine may define the precedent for deterrence in their own region. Inside the European Union, the mood is shifting toward strategic unity. Ursula von der Leyen speaks of a European security pillar, a structure that would operate independently within NATO, but capable of acting without US authorization. For decades, this was a dream or a taboo. Now, driven by necessity, it becomes policy.
Macron, long advocating for strategic autonomy, finds new allies in Warsaw and Stockholm, as the realization spreads that Europe's security cannot depend solely on the unpredictability of American politics. The Ukrainian guarantees become both a test case and a foundation. If Europe can protect Ukraine, it can protect itself. The humanitarian cost, however, continues to climb. Entire districts in Kharkiv and Mykolaiv remain in ruins. The winter brings new waves of displacement as families flee towns where heating systems were destroyed. International aid groups warn of a looming crisis, yet local organizations continue to fill the gaps left by bureaucracy. In Dnipro, a network of volunteer engineers has developed portable power units from recycled vehicle batteries, distributing them to hospitals and schools. Each invention, each act of adaptation, becomes a story of survival. As attention focuses on the battlefield, another war unfolds quietly: the information war. Russian state television repeats narratives of Western exhaustion, of Europe collapsing under economic pressure. But alternative media, both inside and outside Russia, reveal a different reality. Young Russians fleeing the country in unprecedented numbers, scientists and IT specialists relocating to Armenia, Georgia, and Kazakhstan. The exodus of talent is draining Russia's future. Even those who once supported the government now speak in code, expressing doubts through irony and metaphor. Fear remains, but the silence is cracking. In Washington and Brussels, strategists understand that this conflict has become much more than a territorial dispute. It is a struggle over the rules of the 21st century world,
whether borders can be redrawn by force, whether smaller nations have the right to choose their alliances, whether truth can survive under the weight of propaganda. Every strike on a refinery, every negotiation table in Berlin or Miami, every candle lit in a dark Ukrainian apartment is part of this larger confrontation between freedom and coercion. And yet, despite exhaustion and uncertainty, a cautious optimism persists. The Berlin Framework, the American proposals, the European coalition, all point to a growing realization that Ukraine is not a temporary cause, but a permanent partner. Even skeptics acknowledge that its survival is now intertwined with Europe's credibility. If Ukraine endures, so does the post-war order built after 1945. If it falls, a new age of instability begins. The coming months will be decisive. Whether the guarantees transform into real protection or dissolve into another diplomatic illusion depends on choices made in capitals across the world. The fate of Ukraine, and perhaps the fate of the very idea of democratic resilience, will hinge on how those choices align. Until then, the sounds of war continue. Drones in the night sky, sirens echoing through cities, and the distant hope that one day these reports will no longer begin with a number marking another day of war, but with the first day of peace. Stay with us, subscribe to follow the unfolding story, because what happens next will shape not only Ukraine's future, but the world's.